So welcome to Bonded Voices. This episode is entitled, Will the Commercial Real Estate Market Crash in 2024? And we're already seeing signs of a weakened economy. And within there, one of the weakest spots seems to be commercial real estate. Now, that's a pretty big spectrum, but we're talking mainly office. Seems to be doing well in warehouse and flex space, but the office space is where we have a problem. My name's Ian.
This is Loren.
And I'm Greg.
And welcome to Bonded Voices. So, Greg, you're the real estate expert, and we're going to talk about pontificating on whether this is where the economy is going to really fit. Because they've been talking about recession for years.
Right.
People who are best prepared for a recession come out of a recession the best. People who see problems coming, even if they can't be stopped, are usually able to navigate their way through it properly. It's like a storm coming. If you can see it, you can navigate your way around it. And there's too many really smart analysts talking about a correction coming or a crash coming. We're already seeing, I think it's up to 6.57% delinquencies on office notes. And I think the latest figures said there's about 20% of all commercial office space that is empty. Is that what we're looking at the moment?
Yeah, I think those data points are from the MBA. At least it sounds like an article that I saw recently, and it's a valid source for the information. MBA, Mortgage Bankers Association, not the NBA,
right,
National Basketball Association, right? Yeah. I do think that you're absolutely right. So the question is it going to happen, and who cares?
And so what?
Right. And so what? I think that my personal viewpoint is we're in an election year. It's January 2024. And so there are funny things that happen during election years. And what we tend to see in most election years is very little massive economic shift. The exception of that would have been at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. There were some pretty serious cracks in the economy during that transition. But I think that we are in a situation where those that have the ability to make corrections do so in election years.
So we're not a real estate show, but you remember the movie The Butterfly Effect?
Yes.
Butterfly flaps its wings, and just that small motion creates ripple effects that affect everything else. And it makes me think about situations where someone wakes up one day and says, "Oh, look at that! There's a news story about the USS Cole being bombed off Yemen." What? So what? And then 4 years later, they're laying there with a bullet in them. In a foreign nation, right? Those effects happen. So, we're seeing, these cracks in the economy, and we've seen it in our lifetime, even recently, like the housing crisis of, who would have thought a couple of things in the economy created such a nightmare for people, 2007, 8, 9. I had a neighbor who went from multimillionaire to not a multimillionaire very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And, a big part of that was commercial real estate as well. But the ripple effect it had was pretty devastating. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think it's an election year, and I don't think it's going to be, personally, I think there is problems there, definitely. I mean, it's not a ideal scenario, but I think enough stopgaps and crutches will be put into place that will limp it along for another year or so. It's just my personal opinion. 2007 was the original housing crisis, but if you think back in 2000, there was the dot-com bubble that burst, and that was the end of the world then, and
But it did have a ripple effect. I remember, my brother had a company in 2000. And he had, I think, 15 employees. And for no fault of his own, the fear, the contagion that set in, his investors pulled the money out from under it.
Oh, I worked at a startup during 9/11, and we were in the startup had to do with the travel industry, and they thought the travel industry was done. No one's going to fly again. And so all of our funding was pulled from the startup, and we all got laid off. But, that's, unintended consequences of it. But I think, being as it is an election year, I think that we are definitely... It's going to be rocky for sure, but I don't think we're going to see the massive collapse that we saw in 2007.
So it's not residential, but it's commercial. But 20% is a big number. If they're looking at 20% of office space empty, where's that chasm or tipping point?
Well, and I think we can shift the focus of this conversation of not necessarily is it 2024, but what are the challenges? And there will need to be some type of correction. It will either heal itself if the government steps back and lets the market just correct on its own, which they won't. There's a history of that not happening. Too big to fail, all of the things that came out of that last crisis. But I think it would be more important for us to talk about why are 20% of the office square footage unused right now?
Right.
What's caused that vacancy?
I have some thoughts. I think, and I've worked remote myself a lot, especially over the last 5 years, and it's almost become normative now. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of positions that are either fractional, part-time, or just straight remote, where there's no need to go to the office. All your calls are on Zoom.
So in that scenario, let's play that out. So if everyone's remote, the investors are the ones that are hurt, but it doesn't affect the day-to-day businesses. Because the day-to-day businesses right now are already set up since the pandemic to run remote.
And that's another question, right? What percentage of a business can be remote? How much do you need actually in an office space?
Depends if you need smoke breaks, because I have to go to the office every once in a while now. And I see more people taking personal time to go 20 minutes every hour. They're out there smoking a cigarette.
Yeah.
And I'm not...
I wonder if... So here's an interesting idea.
You are listening to Bonded Voices. Subscribe to us on your favorite podcast service or on the web at www.bondedvoices.com. Thank you to all our sponsors. And now, back to the show.
Okay, so you go to the office now more than you had been before.
Correct.
You're noticing 20 minutes on the hour,
yes.
20 minutes of the hour being consumed by smoke breaks. If someone's working from home, do they use that same 20 minutes? I don't know.
I don't think so, because they're probably less stressed because they've got less commute.
Well,
right.
So here's the thing. One person smoking leads to two people smoking.
Yeah, it does.
There we go. Okay.
So I can give you a prime example. When I worked at GoDaddy, Bob Parsons put into a effect where I don't want people smoking anymore. Why? Because outside of his office everyone took their smoke break. So he'd see one or two people every hour. We'd go out there for 20 minutes. He actually fired people that would smoke in their cars because he just didn't want people to leave the building every 20 minutes for every hour. Because you're paying people to do that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely.
It becomes an hour or a day or more that you're paying people to.
So I think you've got remote work, you've got fractional work, you've got all these things pushing people out of office spaces that have no need to go back. Does that account for 20% vacancies and a number that's maybe rising as well? Because I know a few other companies recently who've just said, that's it, we're just going fully remote.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to keep in mind potentially the last time that building was financed. When was that property financed? Was it during COVID? Was it before COVID? Because if we think about what happened of many people working from home, there were many employers, not based on their own decision, but based on public perception, whatever it might be, we're sending everybody home. We're looking out for the staff. We want you all to be safe. I mean, that was the messaging that was across the board everywhere. And so trying to get people to come back to the workforce, come back to the office, is very difficult. We had situations where people moved.
Yeah.
Because they thought, we're never going back to an office. So they moved states. Nobody knew that they moved.
But they did have, and I remember the company I was with at the time, they had a policy where certain people were still required to go in on certain days. Systems people, where they had to maintain systems, security people, a few human resources people, a few finance people. They were all mashed up, the whole thing to go into the office. But there were still a certain amount of people who had to go in. But the vast majority didn't have to. I don't think any of them are fully back to a full-time in the office. Like if you're a salesperson, there's no reason for you to be in the office.
Well, think about this. Most large corporations, you're working on teams that are in different locations.
Yes.
So does it make sense to go into an office to get on a Zoom call with another person that's in a whole other city or state? Having an office space buys you nothing other than an expense. Because, when you have these big corporate buildings or office spaces, that is not cheap. So it's actually cheaper for the employer to put people to work remote.
It is. Now, I think some of them worry that they're not getting productivity out of people. And spinning this back to the whole idea of will there be a commercial real estate crash? And is this one of the effects on it? If our hypothesis is right, I think it has a direct effect on it. But is it 20%? Or is there something else that's driving that 20%? Is it just these are older, undesirable buildings, Greg? Or is it a case of there's just not the businesses to fill it? Like, has the business model changed that much that they no longer need a gathering space?
Here's the thing, is if all the investment money gets tied up in these failed commercial real estate, right, and all the investments go belly up, there'll be no money for small businesses to get new loans and start. So that's the real worry, is whether there'll be money in the economy for new businesses to start. The existing businesses, they'll be fine, right, for the most part, because
depending, they might need additional capital for expansion. They might need. So you're absolutely right. It's the flow of money and the access to capital that's impacted by this.
Right.
Interesting you say that, because there was a report the other day that said, I can't remember the number, of businesses that are looking to refinance debt in the first quarter. And it was pretty big. So
absolutely.
And I know that I've heard and seen and had calls from friends who've just been RIF'd, reduction in force.
Returned to the marketplace.
The asset has been returned to the marketplace.
You've been rimmed?
The
marketplace?
That they're seeing that these companies are doing this in preparation for something. Now, whether they're making themselves agile enough to be sold or whatever it is, but I think it's too broad to be that. They can't all sell to each other. Someone's got to be a buyer.
Sure.
That I think they're doing it, one, for their balance sheet, and two, like we said earlier, that if there's a storm coming, you want to be prepared for it, that you can weather that storm.
Sure. You want to be nimble.
And I'm sure their analysts are telling them that these could be the risk factors and this is what you got to be looking out for.
Well, and if we think about with the interest rates moving up as they have, the Federal Reserve adjusting the Fed funds rate, that's a direct line to what corporations have access to. If you own a large ranch and you want to buy an additional 500 head of cattle and you want financing to do that, it's dramatically more expensive for that today than it was in 2020, 2021.
Right.
And so that is the challenge of, do you grow the organization? Do you just want to stay the same size that you are? Or do you look at cost cutting so that you improve the bottom line? And I think the mention that you had of friends that have been riffed recently, it's probably bottom line, they're trying to make their numbers look as good as possible. So, potentially.
Yeah, you think about the type of businesses that consumed a lot of office space. To me, in my head, I even with the movies like 9 to 5 and things like that, it was where there was a lot of people on typewriters or a lot of people in phone rooms. All of that can be done with AI or remotely now, or offshored or whatever, so they don't need that office space.
Right.
And then you compound that with millennials who living at home, didn't desperate, and we covered it in one of our other podcasts about, is work just for extra cash, or do you need the money to pay bills? And if you're living at home, you don't. So it is that combination of these confluence of all these factors getting to a point where the millennials are going to be the tipping point. They're going to push it over the edge in the fact that they're not going to go into the office. Because I've known some that have even said, if you make me go into the office, I'll just leave.
Well, you asked the question earlier, the 20% reduction in square footage being used. So obviously AI plays into that.
Yeah, there's another input for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think organizations have figured out how to, if you're looking at the bottom line, you have the cost of the square footage, which doesn't matter how many employees you have. That cost is fixed over time. Whereas you reduce your workforce, you're still paying that lease, unless you can get out of the lease. So I think that where this impacts people is back to that other podcast we talked about of what are you going to be doing work-wise? How do you stay nimble in this marketplace to make it through?
Look around here about how much, and they're not all office space, that has been converted into play gyms. There's and all different uses because they don't know what to do with them.
Well, they're still built. That's the funny thing is, you'll see new office buildings still being built all over the valley, and there's buildings that are underutilized or not utilized at all in other parts of town. So it's really weird that they're still building, yet there's already a huge vacancy.
Well, I think there's a lot of different factors that we don't have enough time to discuss. And it might be as simple as motivation that a city might have from a property tax break point of view to build your building in Goodyear versus Phoenix, or trying to attract larger employers. I think there's a lot of different factors that go into that. There's always a life cycle in buildings, right? So some of the really cool architecture that I really enjoy seeing is some of the older cities where you've got red brick warehouses that have been repurposed and are really cool new use for that. And so we're always going to have buildings that exceed their life cycle and they're going to be retrofitted or mowed down.
What do you mean that the punch card building in downtown Phoenix didn't age well?
So let's think of this. Let's and humor me with the hypothesis. Right? Let's say it does collapse. What are the ancillary effects on other businesses and life? Because when a storm comes, it doesn't just rain on you. Trees come down, your neighbor's electricity blows up. There's a lot of things happen. So. And I'm thinking of something we discussed in prep for this, which was who's going to open a coffee shop in the bottom of a office building or a restaurant in an office building when even 20% down plus remote work in the other offices. Because remember, they're talking about 20% empty. How much more of that is actually, you have 100 desks in a space. How many of those are remote?
Right.
Where they don't come in. And how does that go down? So you could have 20% empty in a building plus another 20 or 30% that's not used regularly.
Well, and that's based on when is that lease set to expire? Is it going to get renewed? Or are they going to renegotiate for less square footage. So what we saw during the heights of 2020, 21, 22 was this progression of usage within the commercial space. So if someone was a large tenant and they were using 20,000 square feet, they dropped to 10.
Right.
And those that were using 10 dropped to 5. And
that'd be a great stat to know, is how that utilization has changed year by year. Does someone keep stats on that?
Oh yeah, all of this information is tracked. But where it became interesting is that the smaller offices became much more desirable because everybody was downsizing. So what that did is it alienated the 50,000 square foot spot.
Right.
Because they moved down, everybody moved down. Not necessarily pushing each other, but if your organization requires this much and everybody's working remotely, you only need that core group. You got to make sure the servers are still running. You got to make sure the financial systems are still in order. That core group of people, rather than having 50 people in the office on a daily basis, might be 5 or 7. So you need less square footage. So I think kind of similar in that mindset of, we did see a lot of people struggle that were the coffee shops at the basement of the office buildings and the sandwich shop around the corner that required so much foot traffic in that area at lunchtime, move enough sandwiches to cover their monthly bills. I don't know if we're going to see it this year, but I do think that there were some shifts in the employment market that have yet to be solved to consume all of the office space that is out there.
So here's we were talking about in another podcast, find the job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. So maybe with the there'll be an onslaught of cheap office space or commercial real estate. Maybe this is the opportunity to find your dream job and start your own business.
But if you still don't have workers who want to come in, who cares how cheap it is?
Well, then, are you saying that your dream job requires workers? Maybe it's something that doesn't require it. I mean, the days of requiring workers in there's a push to go for the RTO right now, return to office. There's a push trying to delay the collapse of the commercial real estate. It's a done deal. They've already, people will work from home from now on. There'll be companies that will push back, but then they're going to acquiesce and it's going to go back to work from home. And it's actually a better thing for letting workers work from home because we want people to have a good work-life balance. Whereas, you go into the office, you watch people smoke, there's water cooler talk, you're really only productive 20% of the day. So it's actually a better employee is more productive at a work from home.
So what advice do we have for people who either business owners or looking to start a business in an office, or even someone who's just watching the market and maybe watching their stock portfolio and saying, hey, this actual business is involved in this or something adjacent to commercial real estate, and what should I be looking out for?
From my point of view, people staying nimble and keeping an eye on what's going on. And I can tell you that the commercial brokers that I know of, as well, commercial real estate appraisers, have all of this data, all those data points based on market segments. They can tell you what trends are going on.
Have they got like alarm bells ready at certain moments?
I'm not sure if it would be as far as alarm bells because it's just purely data in very complex Excel spreadsheets.
Right.
I'm sure that someone somewhere has thresholds that will set off alarms, but you look at uncertain times. You look at how much wealth was built out of the residential housing crisis and how many people went out and were able to deploy capital and buy hundreds of homes. And they did that when it was pretty dark out,
right,
and pretty gloomy. And so I'm not recommending that people go out and start buying properties or selling properties or any of that. I'm just saying that looking back historically, that's where a lot of wealth was created. And real estate historically, even when you take into account market corrections, like what we're potentially going to see, real estate historically is still a great long-term investment tool. Obviously, the true benefit is based on when you bought it and when you sold it. But
what do you think, Loren?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm still trying to figure out what we can do in preparing for this. I agree with Greg. If you're able to invest in real estate, if it collapses, invest in it then, or do we petition the government not to bail out the big corporations this time?
Yeah, I'd like that. My advice is, we're the longest we've been, I think, since that cyclical recession. I think you can only hold it off so long before something becomes pretty bad and pretty cataclysmic. I think people have just got to be very wary, be prepared, especially for workers within companies that are tied into those things as well. I think it's one of those things, it's time to maybe polish up the resume. So for this episode of Bonded Voices, hit us up on the website, come register, and we will look forward to hearing you again. I'm Ian.
I'm Greg.
This is Loren.
And we'll see you next time on Bonded Voices.
Thanks for joining.
You are listening to Bonded Voices. Subscribe to us on your favorite podcast service or on the web at www.bondedvoices.com. Thank you to all our sponsors, and now back to the show.